Hi, my name's Rebecca Oatley. I'm part of the Association for Dementia Studies at the University of Worcester in the UK. And my presentation today looks at sport reminiscence for people living with dementia, and specifically considering the space as a location for inclusion. Now, sport reminiscence is reported to be a very popular activity for people affected by dementia. It involves using sport-related prompts, so things like photographs, objects or memorabilia, to trigger memories and conversation. And it's thought to be a particularly enjoyable social activity, providing cognitive stimulation and offering opportunities for participants to experience a positive sense of identity and sense of group belonging. And these can be really important factors for somebody's well-being. More generally, reminiscence is thought to be particularly useful for people living with dementia because it focuses upon memories from earlier in life that might actually be easier to recall in the most typical pattern of short-term memory loss that's seen in dementia. And really the key idea is that those memories from the past can be a conduit to feeling good in the present, whether that's a result of the actual content of the memory itself or the social interaction that it triggers. Now, sport reminiscence is a relatively recent intervention that's developed across the last decade, with publications appearing in the UK, Spain and USA. And it was originally designed under the guise of encouraging men to take up group activities, on the basis that they were often quite reticent to join existing community groups. However, that kind of rationale is rooted in traditional hegemonic masculinity and is based upon an oversimplistic idea that implies a natural and beneficial connection between men and sport. Now, thus far, neither research nor practice has recognised the potential problematic nature, the significant sociocultural dynamics of power at play. And this kind of limited hegemony can actually be exclusive and unhelpful to the many people whose interests or identity vary from that dominant mode of masculinity. And my study took an ethnographic approach to sport reminiscence group activities, and the focus was in the community, and that is groups that met outside of care home settings. And early on I realised that despite an absence of female voices in literature, there were often many women at community groups. And these were a mixture of women living with dementia and female carers. So my study is the first to focus upon these unheard female voices, with a goal of better understanding the concept and the potential of sport reminiscence. And it's informed by a number of theoretical influences, including feminist approaches to sport and theories of personhood and person-centred care in dementia. Now, what I found was that the dominant male culture was very evident. Taken for granted assumptions really underpinned both the content and the practice of sport reminiscence. Many women understood the groups as being directed towards the interests of men, often describing that they came as company for their husbands, despite sometimes having actually quite a vested interest in sport themselves. Now, the topics were always centred upon the dominant male sports, so things like soccer and rugby, and women were almost never asked about their own particular experiences related to these themes. In reminiscence narratives and general group discourse, women were often positioned or positioned themselves as subordinate to men, and there's a couple of examples I've got for you. I suppose I got a bit into the football because of the boys, you see. You either beat them or you join them. And Mary says she prefers women's football, but her son tells her the women are no good. And finally, anyone who sees pictures of mum and dad, she was a wag, wasn't she? So you can see that there was often this distinct kind of hierarchy and separation between men and women. Now, a second key aspect of the dominant male culture was that narratives often celebrated hypermasculine attributes, things like toughness and competitiveness, whilst often simultaneously derogating more maybe typical feminine qualities, things like perhaps being emotional, dramatic or concerned with aesthetics. And here's an example from Dawn, a carer at a rugby group, who actually criticises footballers for being overdramatic and suggesting somehow they aren't real men. She says, you wouldn't get that at the football. It's more like theatre, all that screaming and rolling around. Here it's tough men. They just keep going and going. They never want to come off the pitch. Now, these narratives can actually be particularly difficult for some women, not simply because they celebrated more masculine qualities. Indeed, some women were very proud of their exploits of toughness and competitiveness. But rather, these narratives could cause some distress for women who might recognise a link with their partner's dementia. In the case of Harry, a former professional footballer, his wife and daughter were both proud of his former status as fan favourite and football hero, but simultaneously felt a sense of resentment towards football and that common celebratory rhetoric, actually seeing his toughness and his willingness to play through injury as one of the reasons behind Harry's current dementia condition. And Kath reflects a little on her feelings. She says, Harry would also put his head on the end of a boot and not think twice about it. I believe that football has caused Harry's dementia. I was sat thinking the other day, when people talk to me about Harry a lot, they talk about all his football, but I also think about all the other things, Now, likely in part due to a culture of hegemonic masculinity, women rarely revealed their sporting pasts in the group environment, but through one-to-one conversations and interviews, they revealed that actually sport could be a really meaningful topic for some women. Now, often their memories were very typical feminine sports, things like netball or dance, but they also often revealed a very typical pattern of lifelong activity. And it was common for women to recall childhood opportunities for sports participation and spectating that quite often ceased when they got married or started a family. Now, at this point, many women's roles would change to service the leisure of others through activities such as childcare, transport, providing refreshments. And these kind of narratives actually upheld that very typical gendered domestic ideology and really reinforced the male sporting privilege on which sport reminiscence is based. And this kind of content could actually reinforce a subordinate status for women that could impact on the expectations required of women in their current lives. However, there were also examples of very atypical activities. So lots of early involvement in football, early life involvement in football, rugby, and one woman who was actually a champion motor racer. And this shows that actually sport can be a really valuable location in which stereotypes can be challenged if you're given the opportunity, the time and the space to do so. The content of these sport-related memories was much varied, but showed that reminiscence could be a useful communication tool if it was delivered in a sensitive and effective way. And really, it offered women opportunities to share aspects of their identity. So who I am, where I'm from, as well as maybe things I've done, things I know, or similarities that we actually might share in common. And these kind of things can be really important for someone whose identity or sense of place in the world might actually be threatened by the stigma of dementia or simply old age. And I'll share with you an example of Carol, who was a woman living with dementia. Now, for her, reminiscence about her sporting past brought a realisation that her continued physical activities were a key aspect of being able to uphold her sense of identity. Her dementia impacted her verbal communication, and this made talk-focused groups very difficult for her. But through her long-distance walking challenges and the training that she did, she continued to be able to experience for herself and to communicate to others a real sense of toughness and competitiveness that she felt represented the same lifelong identity that she had demonstrated playing hockey as a young girl. Now, although she was initially quite wary of identifying as either sporty or tough, through exploring her sporting past in relation to her present, Carol recognised that actually sport and activity is a key aspect that allows her to embody a sense of who she is, in spite of the impact that dementia has elsewhere in her life. And she says, all these things are not so good, but so walking is great, is better, I can do it, I can still achieve. The sport, hockey, walking the marathon is about who I am. Now, it should be recognised that it was not just women who rarely shared personal experiences in the group activities. In fact, there was often little reminiscence activity as a whole. What there was usually revolved around a group discussion or quizzes that were actually quite difficult to take part in. often maybe just one or two voices would dominate the discussion, with other people unwilling or maybe unable to take part. Some groups had very large numbers, up to 60 in attendance, which actually made it a very unnatural environment in which to interact. All groups were mixed, so they involved a combination of people living with dementia and without. And this meant that care partners, or those with uninhibited verbal communication, could actually dominate the time and space within the group. And this left the people who had symptoms that perhaps affected their cognitive speed or their communication ability actually somewhat excluded. Now, it was very rare, actually, for groups to make use of objects or to recognise maybe alternate non-verbal ways through which people could be engaged or participate. And Hayley brought her mother regularly to a rugby group, reflected upon this. She said, "It isn't so social here. Some people are quite verbal, so I guess for them it is more social. Some are obviously listening, but some only come for the free butties." And Carol echoed similar frustration. She said cafe is mixed group, and so family do most of the talking, and groups which talk over each other. And she screwed up her face and shook her head to indicate that actually this was not an environment she felt included in. So where does sport reminiscence go? Now, from the individual conversations I had with women in this study, it's clear that sport reminiscence can be a powerful activity for some women, indeed for maybe some people. But there are significant barriers to inclusion in its current guise within community care. It is limited by a culture restricted to very typical hegemonic masculinity, but it's also limited by the modes of delivery that rely on verbal ability, alongside actually evaluations that simply equate numbers in attendance to success without maybe taking that more critical approach to evaluate engagement. Our sport is imbued with underlying sociocultural assumptions, and these can be barriers to engagement. Yet sport can also offer opportunity to challenge stereotypes, and actually I think it's well placed to celebrate the diversity of people living with dementia. Indeed, as a kind of context, it actually holds great potential in moving beyond classic conversation style interventions to offer an opportunity to do or to embody reminiscence. So I mean not just talking, but also acting and interacting in a way that maybe recognises people's different skills and also makes use of past experiences or sensations in order to feel good and included in the present. Now, for me, a more creative and a much more person-centred approach to sport reminiscence that really tailors activities to these specific interests and the communication strengths and needs of each participant is really essential if the intervention is actually to be beneficial and to be inclusive. And that's all I've got for you today. I want to say thank you very much for listening, and thank you also to the Journal of Emerging Sports Studies for providing me with this opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you.